Hello, it's me again. I'm back with another video. My kids are imploring me to make more videos. I don't know why. They have ulterior motives or something. But again, this video is going to be designed primarily to help save you money by giving you a little bit of information that you can use to not get ripped off and to know what you're buying and what you're doing and researching. So, said in the last video, we'll go over some sword terms because you notice in some of the eBay sales and other sales, they go over sword terms. And sometimes, I know these sword terms are listed like you went to school for this and you studied this and this was like your passion. But, you know, we'll go over simply what they mean, the main ones. So, and you might hear the bird squawking in the background. Sorry, I can't do anything about that. Well, I can. I have swords here, but we're not going to do that. So the first term is nagasa. It'll say nagasa. That means the length. Usually length of just the blade part, not the tang part. But you might want to check that out just to be sure. Like we said before, as you might imagine, there are some less than scrupulous or less than knowledgeable sellers on eBay who might list Nagasa as the length of the whole thing, although if it's a sale from Japan, they should know better. Sori means curvature, like how much the blade is curved. Usually, that's not a huge deal unless you get something with an extreme sori. Usually, if it's extreme, that means the blade has been retempered. In some cases, blades would be retempered because it was damaged in a fire or damaged somehow. But what that does is it totally destroys the original characteristics of the blade, and you end up with pretty much a whole different blade, and they have other physical characteristics that are noteworthy, which, you know, I could cover in another video because that's a whole other thing. Hamon is... The ha means edge, mon means like badge or the symbol, you know, of the blade. And I have a sword here. I brought examples. I'll show you. You can look closely and see the hamon. That's kind of like the milky white part of the blade here. And that's where the tempered edge is. And there's really two kinds of hamon, if you will. There's really two main kinds, Hadori and Sashikomi. This is Hadori. You can see almost looks like the line is traced, right, with polishing stones, and it was. So that's where it's almost like an applied effect. Sashikomi is more of a polishing effect where the blade is polished in such a way where what you see of the hamon is what you get. Where it's not as bright white as a Hadori finish, but it tends to pick up more on details where there's bits of tempering throughout the blade itself. But you have to be careful with the Hadori finish because sometimes some very clever polishing can hide flaws. And the Boshi, again, I'll show you with a different blade. The Boshi is the tempered edge, and you could probably see it there, here, see? As it goes through the Kasaki. The Kasaki is the term for this tip part itself. You can see the line there. You can probably see the line that differentiates the body of the blade from the point section. Where this line goes over here, that's the Kasaki. The hamon is the part of the tempered edge the Boshi is the part of the hamon tempered edge in the Kasaki. And the hara, that's a little harder to see. The hara means the grain of the blade because most blades, again, the Japanese swords, there are almost as many exceptions as there are rules. The hara is the grain of the blade within the blade itself. And it can vary anywhere from like a wood grain to a very fine, like almost like rice bran grain. Some of them are more obvious than others. But you also have to be really careful when you're bidding on a sword not to mistake acid etching for hara. The hara is supposed to be brought out in the polishing process through finer and finer specialized stones, not through acid. The problem with using the acid is it doesn't just bring out a grain of the blade, it'll bring out anything that's at any depth in the blade too. Scratches, pits, holes, and it gets in there and it continues to eat away. This is another reason why you don't want an acid etched blade. So how to tell that is acid etched blades usually look like a Damascus effect. The Damascus effect, some people will advertise like, oh, beautiful Japanese Damascus. Those terms don't go together. There should be no like crazy Damascus effect on a blade where it's really like poppingly obvious. If that happens when you see something for sale, it usually means it's a Chinese fake. Don't buy that. Unless it's really cheap and you're gonna use it to like chop apples or something. If you are, then go for it. So, next thing to go over are flaws in a blade. The main flaw, like I said in the previous video, is hagire. Ha, edge, gire, cut. It's like a crack in the blade. Usually, another example of a blade, usually it's this way. So if you have a blade that's straight up, usually your hagire will be this way. And it's usually not here. It's usually at the area called the monuchi, which is going to do most of the cutting. It's usually here, around this part. And it can be, like I said, a fine pencil line that's barely visible, or it could be something that's glaringly obvious. So you have to watch out for that. That's important. Because, like I said, you can have a fine blade otherwise, a fine fighting cutting implement. If it has a hagire, pretty much worthless. Fukure is another term. Those are blisters in the blade. It's usually caused by forging flaws. A lot of these are due to forging flaws. And the way a Japanese sword is traditionally forged is you get a piece of the metal and it's folded many times in and of itself. Not many times, but enough times where it produces these layers in the steel. But anytime you heat up the metal and you fold it over and you fold it over again, you could have room for error in the forgings. And sometimes those come out only after polishing process, and sometimes only after a few hundred years, and you get another polishing process, and then whoop, there we go, we found a fukure. And those can be really small or they can be really big. I have a blade here where I'll show you a fukure in a little bit. So another error you could have or flaw in a blade is ware. They're very common. They're like minor forging flaws. They're supposed to be minor forging flaws. They can be little hairline flaws that they don't run, like I said, they don't run this way. They run this way. If you get a little opening that runs this way, especially if it's not in the hamon here, it's not such a big deal. Those are common on a lot of blades. Again, not on this blade, but I'll show you. If they're really big and they're in the cutting edge, you might want to avoid that. If they're not in the cutting edge, it's up to you. You also have to consider the age of the blade. I would say any blade that's newer than 200 years old, which is not really old for Japanese swords, that has these big ware in the blade, I would pass, unless you get a really great deal. So this, an example of a ware. I see a forging opening here, but this blade is rather old. My guess is 500 years old. Again, that's not really old as far as Japanese swords go, but we'll go into that. There are other openings in this blade. See, there's an opening towards the tip there. You can probably see right around there. And there are ware along the back going this way along the mune. The mune is the back of the blade. And most blades will have what's known as an iare mune, like a roof shape to the back of the blade. It can vary from high to shallow, and that could be indicative of smiths and schools. That's a whole other thing. We'll go into that. Don't worry about that. You might want to check it out this way on a sword auction, because you're going to want to be sure that it's straight. Because if you see this, that's something to consider. If you really like it, otherwise you can get a good deal. Probably a polisher can fix that, but it's going to cost you. So, omegane is another term. Those are filled holes where perhaps there was a fukure that was fixed, exposed. The problem with omegane, I've noticed in my experiences, they can fall out. They can come loose, especially with a fresh polish or a new polish. And in that case, you got to have a polisher who's skilled enough to put in a new omegane, or you have to be okay with the way it looks if you just leave it alone. And maybe you're okay with the way it looks. That's up to you. But again, the main flaws to watch out for, hagire, and ware. The ware can be so big, or even the fukure, the blisters, they can be so big as to detract from the beauty of this sword. Usually not the functionality, but hagire, definitely the functionality. And I know you're probably not going to buy something for like $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 and go outside and chop bamboo with it. Please don't do that. You can use a newer sword for that. But a lot of the value in Japanese swords is based upon the condition and the hypothetical usability. All right, the next thing to go over are sword eras. That's another thing you'll see advertised. And sword eras versus historical periods. Sometimes those things are used interchangeably. And sometimes they match up more or less, but sometimes they don't. The main eras are Koto, Shinto, Shin-Shinto, and Gendaito. And there's sword eras after Gendaito, but we're not really going to be too concerned with that, because then you get out of the World War II era where swords didn't really see a lot of use, so that's something we're not going to focus on for now. All right, Koto is about the year 900 to 1596. Now, I know what you're saying. Well, what if I find a sword that's older than 900? Well, if you find a, genuine Japanese sword that's older than the year 900 on eBay, let people know after you buy it. Especially if it's under like, I don't know, $30,000 or $40,000. The chances are exceedingly slim. The chances are exceedingly slim also that you're going to find anything from the Koto period, or the Koto era, if I would, that's before 12 or 1300. As you can imagine, these were items, these swords, that were made to be used and to save your life and to take the life of an enemy. They weren't really, most of them, even, or I should say especially, back a long time ago, used just for like general decoration. Or like, oh, this is so pretty, look at this. A lot of these were weapons meant to kill and prevent from being killed. They were used. So, as with anything else that's used, they become more rare as they get older. So, the Shinto period, or sword era, is more like 1597 or the year 1600 to about late mid-1700s. Shin-Shinto, late 1700s to about 1867. And that 1867 date is important because sometimes you'll see swords advertised that says, oh, genuine Japanese samurai sword. Like, well, no blade made after 1867 is a samurai sword. It's just not, because there were no samurai after 1867. During the late Edo period, the government, the new imperial government, passed a whole bunch of these edicts to really transform society. And along with that, the samurai transformed. They wanted to push these guys out of being hereditary warriors tied to clans and families to being more or less part of a government and new society. Part of that was they converted their stipends from rice to cash, blah, blah, blah. There's other things that they did. The other thing they did is they prohibited them from wearing swords out in public. That's a big thing. If you're a samurai and you can't wear a sword out in public, what kind of samurai are you really, you know? So it's not a samurai sword made after 1867. And especially in those years following 1867 to about the World War I, World War II era, newly made swords were extremely rare. There wasn't a high demand for them except for the new military, but that's a whole other topic we'll get into later. So the Gendaito era is about, you know, like I said, 1870s to 1945. And we're talking about, again, we're talking about traditionally made swords. Because the World War I, World War II era, they needed more blades because all the Japanese officers, the officers, were expected to have a sword. And when you need that many swords, a lot of times the careful skill of making a traditional Japanese blade out of tamahagane, the traditional Japanese steel, a lot of times that couldn't happen. So they were made with old railway steel, and they were made oil tempered, and those are considered more Showa-to, meaning in the Showa era. Around 1926 to 1945 is the Showa era. So you see something that was made in the 20s or 30s or 40s during World War II advertised as a Japanese samurai sword. That's not really possible. Those don't go together. That can't be. It could be a Gendaito, in which case it would have to be traditionally made, not oil tempered, and made with tamahagane. Those swords are usually indicated by the absence of stamps on the tang. And again, that's something I'll go over in another video. I'll show you. I have swords with many, stamps, or many swords with various stamps on the tang. Usually, stamps on the tang indicate Showa-to, not something traditionally made. Not a bad weapon, not collectible. They're of course collectible, but they're not traditionally made Japanese swords. So the sword, where the sword eras differentiate from historical periods are the Kamakura period. Sometimes you'll see swords advertised as being from Kamakura period. I'm skeptical unless it comes with NBTHK or NTHK papers. And that's another thing. I'll go over what that means real quick. NBTHK stands for Nihonto Bijutsu Token Hozan Kyokai. All right, but basically what that means is Society for the Preservation of the Japanese Art Sword. There's another organization, NTHK, Nihonto Token Hozan Kyokai, Society for the Preservation of the Japanese Sword. The good part about both of these organizations, they're based in Japan, and the people on their boards, on their Shinsa panels, they're called Shinsa panels, are people, Japanese guys, usually very knowledgeable in Japanese swords. That helps. So, they're knowledgeable in these Japanese swords, and they can differentiate between the different eras and periods and schools and smiths and so forth, which, as you can imagine, is rather complicated.